Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our, I think it's the third lecture in our Making Change Irish Immigrant Activism series, which we're delighted to say is partly funded by a grant from Humanities New York, which of course is sponsored as well by the National Endowment for the Humanities. So we've heard about a transgender soldier, Father Michael Judge, and his activism for constituents and AIDS sufferers and fire workers in New York City. We also heard about Irish American and Irish immigrant women in labour. And tonight's one is actually about, I suppose, kind of legal and journalistic activists. So several of them were, directly from Ireland in terms of their status, but some of them, are descended. And the important thing, I suppose, is that these immigrants were in a position to be able to hopefully influence people in power, or at least to kind of look for change. Sorry, I'm just making sure that we are live on Facebook. This always takes a few seconds for the Facebook stuff to go through. So, of course, Irish immigrants have been coming to the country since its very inception. And so our first immigrant activist is actually, and even though he wasn't in Albany for very long, but the New York governor, Thomas Dongan. And I will say that some of these speakers, or people that I'm going to talk about tonight, have mentioned their Irishness and how important that was in their own role as activists. Certainly, Thomas Dongan, I think, having lived under British rule as a Catholic landowner, as somebody who was, his family were royalist supporters and they were then, isolated for a little while. His own experience, absolutely, I would say, impacted him. So Thomas Dongan was the first royal governor of New York, born in County Kildare in 1634. He was the son of a member of the Irish Parliament, which of course there was a parliament in Ireland at the time, and went with his family, as I mentioned, into exile in France following the overthrow of the King Charles. He was active in the French military and by 1674 was in fact a colonel. He returned to England in 1678 and was favoured with both military and governmental appointments through James Stuart, who had been an officer in the French army with him, but was of course brother to King Charles. So Stuart was the Duke of York, and he sent Dongan, when he was colonel, to America in 1682 to serve as the governor of this new province, New York, recently taken over, of course, from the Dutch. Dongan spoke a little Dutch and French, and that was one of the main things in his favour, apparently. But he was granted tracts of land on Staten Island, where he later built a mansion, and elsewhere, of course, in the colonies. And he is famously known for setting up in 1683, we just celebrated the anniversary the other day, actually, New York's first representative assembly, which was granted several rights that I'll go into in a second. He established both New York and Albany. Well, New York was already established, but he established Albany as a city with a charter, and he proved to be an able leader. And he was, of course, finally replaced when James was removed from the throne later on. So after being governor, he lived for a while at his estate on Staten Island and is thought to have returned to England in about 1691. He inherited the title, the Earl of Limerick, even though he was the second son when his older brother died. And the family, to be honest, were kind of in debt. They didn't have a whole pile of money. But he was quite elderly, 82 when he died in 1715, and was poor. But the important thing is this charter. And so the Charter of Liberties and Privileges, which was granted, in His Royal Highness's name to the inhabitants of New York and dependencies. It stated, for the better establishing the government of this province of New York, and that justice and right may be equally done to all persons within the same, be it enacted by the governor, council, and representatives now in General Assembly, met and assembled, and by the authority of the same. That the supreme legislative authority under His Majesty and Royal Highness James, Duke of York, Albany, etc., shall forever be and reside in Governor Council, and the people met in General Assembly. So the people are mentioned for the first time in American history, anticipating or perhaps inspiring the democratic spirit which later on, of course, features so strongly in the Constitution. So the king did have the right to legislate in conjunction with the two houses of parliament. The colony was to have two legislative bodies, the council and the assembly, and the governor would have the right to veto. But it was based on actually liberties that, you know, the English already had, this kind of constitutional monarchy. But there are very important clauses. The session of the assembly should be held every 3 years. Freeholders and free men, so, you know, particularly landholders, of course, you know, property is important, shall have a free voice and vote in the election of representatives. The assembly shall be the sole judge of the qualifications of its members. Representatives would be paid for service and for travel. No representative during the session or while going or returning shall be arrested unless in case of high treason or felony. And now this is more interesting because it refers to the rights of the we'll call them the non-political maybe element. No one shall be punished unless found guilty after due process of the law and by a jury of his peers. No taxes shall be levied without the consent of the assembly. All of this is foreshadowing, you know, the issues that come up, of course, during the American Revolution. No soldiers or sailors shall be quartered on the inhabitants except during actual warfare. Martial law shall not be proclaimed. No court shall sell a man's property without his consent unless in satisfaction of a just debt. A woman after her husband's death shall have as her dower the third part of all the lands of her husband, which was important, you know, when perhaps male sons were able to sort of take the mother's property and you know, keep her dependent on them. Now she's entitled to a third. Finally, that no person or persons which profess faith in God by Jesus Christ shall at any time be anyways molested, punished, disquieted, or called in question for any difference in opinion or matter of religious concernment, who do not actually disturb the civil peace of the province, but that all and every such person or persons may from time and at all times freely have and fully enjoy his or their judgments or consciences in matters of religion throughout all the province. Now this is important because, of course, you know, I've mentioned that the fact that he was a Catholic, I think, made him a little bit vulnerable, you know, to this. He certainly was open to the fact that Catholics in a largely, we'll call it WASP type society would have needed the protection. Of course, it does not allow protections technically to Jewish people, for instance, or people who are not of the faith of Jesus Christ, but that was amended actually not long afterwards. So Dongan, you know, showed himself to be a ruler of basically a broad mind, and certainly maybe more forward-looking than other colonial governors. He built his laws, as I mentioned, on kind of the Magna Carta, and so inhabitants who were loyal citizens of England, you know, were given the kind of freedoms and privileges that they had enjoyed at home, but so were the rest of the population. So this, of course, in New York meant people like the Dutch, you know. The principle of no taxation without representation, which of course is later used, as I mentioned, during the independence, was enunciated in this charter for the first time. And so New York kind of surpassed, you know, certainly Virginia, which of course, you know, and Massachusetts set up really by the Puritans, surpassed them in religious tolerance. The other thing this charter did, or the Assembly at least does, was pass an act to allow for naturalization of foreigners. And so by the application of an oath of allegiance to the new country, you know, people who were moving here could quite quickly become citizens. And I think that was something sort of forward-looking too, you know, that you could vote in your new home, you know, that there was this element of trying to kind of assimilate is not quite the right word, but to afford people rights in their new homes. So the next man, there's all these pictures, sorry, who was also a legal guy, was Thomas Addis Emmet, who, of course, you know, born in Ireland. His brother was Robert Emmett, killed during the 1798 uprising. So Emmett became legal advisor at home. Thomas Addis Emmet was involved with the Society of United Irishmen, which had been non-sectarian, secret, but it was a military organisation, and the objectives were parliamentary reform based on, naturally, universal male suffrage, but Catholic emancipation, for instance, even though, as I say, some of the members were Protestant, and they did want independence from Britain for Ireland. So Emmett in 1792 1792 drew up the Counter Manifesto of the United Irishmen, and in 1795 he took the oath of the society in open court, the Law Society and the United Irishman Society. Now, in 1796, the British government enacted the Insurrection Act, the Suspension of the Habeas Corpus Act, and the Martial Law Act. So the United Irishmen, inspired by both the American and French revolutions, planned an uprising. But before the hostilities took place, the leaders were arrested on charges of treason and conspiracy and were imprisoned. So naturally, this uprising was, very easily put down. Thomas and his associates were released from prison in 1802 on the condition that they would permanently leave the country. So Emmett initially moved to France and supported Robert, who was in France at the time, with planning another uprising, the 1803, horribly unsuccessful one. So Thomas was still in France when he heard that Robert had been captured and hanged by the British authorities, and so he immigrated to the United States. And he had trained in Ireland and Scotland as a medical doctor, but when an older brother died, he then went on to read the bar. So when he came to New York, he sought admission to the New York bar, but his application was opposed by leading Federalists on the grounds that he was an alien revolutionary, and because he was he wasn't Catholic, but Irish people in general, if they were Catholics, had to take the test oath, it was called. So a Dutch colleague, Abraham van Vechten, moved in the New York Supreme Court an order trying to admit Emmett to the bar, arguing that because the New York statute regarding attorney admission should require neither an oath of abjuration or an oath of allegiance, his alienism was no bar to admission to the legal profession. And the court was granted that, so he was finally admitted to practice to the bar in 1805. And he quickly gained a reputation for excellence in legal cases. Judge Story said of him that he was by, quote, universal consent in the first rank of American advocates. He served as the Attorney General of New York in 1812 and then went back to a very busy legal practice. He was one of the members of the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick, which did a lot of charity work for Irish immigrants at the time. And the New York law reports indicate that he argued over 300 cases before the New York Court of Chancery, the New York Supreme Court of Judicature, and the New York Court for the Correction of Errors. One of the cases, he did many kind of famous ones actually to do with Fulton and the steamships. There was a lot of kind of commercial law, but one of my favorites that he argued was in the Ingen case, where he was counsel for a child, an orphaned child, grandparents. The father had never really been present, although they had been married when the child was born, but the mother, he became bankrupt, and the mother returned to her family home with the children. So they had grown up, with their grandparents. Then the mom died, and all of a sudden the father, who had never even visited the kids, wanted custody. And Emmett argued that as I said, he represented the grandfather. He argued that in custody cases involving young children that are brought to the Supreme Court, that the court should consider the best interests of the child and not necessarily, the overarching, at that time, paternity rights. So he was kind of forward-looking, I think, too. He died in 1827 while arguing about the Snug Harbor case in the New York Circuit Court. So, he was a man who had done a lot, as I say, with the test oath, with kind of pushing the boundaries of being an alien, and for his own community with the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick, setting up even things like soup kitchens and, giving people work. Their records are available down at the American Irish Historical Society. And, there's some fascinating insights into the life of poor immigrants at the time, because, of course, all of these immigrants were, Emmett certainly wealthy and professional, Now, the next one we're going to look at is one of our first journalists. The Dispatch newspaper in Pittsburgh was published first in 1846 during the Great Hunger by Heron Foster. And in May 31st of 1846, news of Zachary Taylor's army crossing the Rio Grande was the first Sunday edition of this paper. Finally, about 20 years later, two employees, Alexander Rook and Daniel ONeill, purchased half an interest in the paper, and when Foster died 2 years later, they bought the entire interest, and they had, as I say, previously worked. After the building was destroyed by fire in 1877, Rook and ONeill took the opportunity to build a new office, and they updated the printing technology that would double the size of the 4-page newspaper. The Dispatch began to utilize the perfecting press method, which allowed printing on both sides of a smaller sheet of paper at once, which was at the time unique to Pittsburgh and rare within the United States. Now, Daniel ONeill this is the house that he built towards the end of his life, which he barely lived in before he died. But, you know, he came from humble beginnings and then rose through the ranks in Pittsburgh. He was born in Clockbone in Wexford on New Year's Day in 1830. His father, Hugh, was principal of a school, and his mother was Kate Navin. And of course, they had 12 children, of which Daniel was the oldest. He did begin working as a journalist in Ireland. He contributed to the Wexford Independent, but by 1851 he had immigrated to America and was living in Pittsburgh. He became editor and owner of the Dispatch, as I said, along with actually his brother Eugene, and he also served on the city council. Now, apparently his energy was really what drove the paper forward, even though he was in partnership with his partner Rook as well. The paper had been run down, and this new firm, you know, along with the technology, there was a lot of excitement kind of thing, and he turned a pygmy sheet, it was said, into a powerful giant. As a writer, Mr. ONeill possessed what is usually termed a trenchant pen. This is from his obituary. He was quick, incisive, and if occasion served, bitter. He was aggressive rather than inviting, and when in municipal affairs any scheme lacked his approbation, the public were sure to find it out, and very soon. He was by no means a polished writer, although his education was classical and his reading varied. His unpolished sentences were wonderfully vigorous, however, and he may be said to have possessed a style almost incapable of imitation. So the Dispatch had correspondence posted nationwide and didn't rely on a wire service. And they had a London bureau who would report on international news. But why I think this man is so interesting in one way is because they employed Elizabeth Cochrane, a female journalist who wrote about the plight of working women, and it wrote from Mexico as a correspondent during the late 1870s, early 1880s. Now, Elizabeth Cochrane, there's his brother, Edward ONeill. Elizabeth Cochrane was better known as Nellie Bly, and she was born in Pennsylvania at the turmoil during the American Civil War in a small town which actually honored her family. They had been quite wealthy. They owned Cochrane's Mill. She was the granddaughter of Robert Cochrane, who had arrived in the US from Derry in the 1790s. Her father was a member of the judiciary, but he died while Elizabeth was only 6 years old, and so her family struggled financially after that. So, you know, she worked hard to try to help her mother. She found a condescending article published in the Pittsburgh Dispatch, which was entitled "What Girls Are Good For," and it provoked a fiery response from this young girl, who wrote a letter to the editor, dramatically signed "Lonely Orphan Girl." The editor, Mr. ONeill, was so impressed with her rebuttal that he actually ran an ad in the paper asking for whoever wrote it to come forward and identify themselves. So he met Elizabeth, and impressed with her spirit, he offered her a job. Of course, women normally wrote under a pseudonym at the time, and so Nellie Bly was suggested because it was the subject of a popular, at the time, Stephen Foster song, Another Man with Irish Roots. And so Nellie was spelled Nellie at the time, and Nellie was born. So she travelled to Mexico. Here she was photographed in Mexico, despite knowing no Spanish, and she lived among Mexican people, sending back reports on their daily lives and customs. Her streak as a crusader manifested itself, and she soon had to flee the country before being arrested for criticizing the government of the dictator Diaz. Her dispatches were later compiled into a book entitled 6 Months in Mexico. So although she had proven herself to ONeill as an investigative reporter, she found really that she was given a lot of domestic topics and, you know, women's kind of columns, despite her protests. And so eventually she allegedly left a note on his desk one day, said, "I'm off for New York, look out for me." And she talked her way into a job at the New York World, which was at the time published by Joseph Pulitzer. And of course, which some of the most prominent journalism awards are still named after Pulitzer. Now, allegedly, she went to him with an idea to infiltrate the lunatic asylums, and that's what got her foot in the door. But he did encourage her, as we were going through the yellow journalism phase. Pulitzer and Hearst are in their ratings war, so he encouraged her to focus on sensationalist kind of stories that would increase the circulation of his paper. But she was prepared to go to lengths that other journalists would not, and she did use her pieces to highlight issues and to try to spark, public outcry against injustices. So her first major scoop was an expose on the mistreatment of patients at Blackwell's Island, the women's lunatic asylum. And in fact, she had to fake madness to gain admission into the facility. She practiced a faraway expression in a mirror and stopped, bathing for a couple of days, dressed in tattered second-hand clothes, and checked into a boarding house for women, where all of a sudden she kind of started speaking with an accent, and she was looking for her trunk, which didn't exist, and just started raving. And that was what was so interesting about her, the start of the story. Within 24 hours, the residents were complaining that they were in fear of their lives. A judge, she was brought to a judge by police, and she was remanded to Bellevue's psychiatric ward, where the chief doctor, and you can see there's a sketch in her book, diagnosed her as, quote, delusional and undoubtedly insane. And she was committed to the asylum. Incarcerated for 10 days. There was an agreement, that the paper would come and release her. I don't think she intended to stay 10 days, to be honest, but they kept her there. And so she witnessed the horrific abuse, of the inmates by the nurses in particular. She wrote, they inject so much morphine and chloral that the patients are made crazy. I have seen the patients wild for water from the effects of the drugs, and the nurses would refuse it to them. I have heard women beg for a whole night for one drop, and it was not given them. I myself cried for water until my mouth was so parched and dry that I could not speak. She wrote of spoiled food, the lack of warm clothing or bedclothes, and of course the treatment of ice-cold baths that were almost like waterboarding to kind of suppress their hysteria. The matrons were abusive. Some were actually inmates from a penitentiary that shared the island, and they were put in charge of these very vulnerable women who regularly beat and choked the patients. But she said worse again were the prolonged periods of social isolation. She wrote, take a perfectly sane and healthy woman, shut her up and make her sit from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. on straight back benches. Do not allow her to talk or move during these hours. Give her no reading and let her know nothing of the world or its doings. Give her bad food and harsh treatment and see how long it will take to make her insane. 2 months would make her a mental and physical wreck. More concerningly, Bly found that, that many of the women confined at the asylum were sane. One patient she talked about was a German woman whose only illness was that she had such a thick German accent that they thought she was speaking gibberish. Some were, of course, inconvenient wives whose husbands had put them away. Ominously, at some point after 3 or 4 days, Bly actually dropped the insane act completely because she thought she had achieved her goal. And she said, the more sanely I talked and acted, the crazier I was thought to be. So it was clear that once a woman was committed, it was virtually impossible, to be released. After 10 days, finally, the lawyers for the newspaper appeared with a court order for her release. She had been, brought in, as I said, as a kind of a Jane Doe. Her expose behind asylum bars later formed her book, of course, 10 Days in a Madhouse, and it became a nationwide sensation and made her a celebrity. This attention resulted in about $1 million being donated to her and to the paper, which was, of course, huge money at the time, and she donated it for the treatment of the mentally ill in the city. But, the other thing I think that came from her work was the ease with which she had fooled not only the police and the judge, but the medical professionals, coupled then with the grievous malpractices that she had highlighted in her reports, led to a grand jury investigation of Blackwell's. And so over the next 10 years, she went on to expose a litany of abuses in jails, factories, and don't forget, this is, well before the Triangle Factory fire, for instance, the orphanages and tenements, often operating under a false identity. Now, on a kind of lighter note, What she maybe is best remembered for today is her 1889 circumnavigation of the world to break the record, the fictitious record set by Jules Verne's Phileas Fogg in Around the World in 80 Days. Pulitzer, you know, was mad to capitalize on how popular this would be. It was sort of, you know, going to get global recognition for the paper. And so she did, you know, set off. And not only did Nellie Bly set off, but another woman reporter for Cosmopolitan, Elizabeth Bisland, went in the opposite direction, hoping to pass her out. So the paper printed daily updates on her journey, and that she went through Great Britain, France, where she met Jules Verne, Italy, Egypt, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Singapore, China, and Japan. And she landed back in San Francisco 2 days behind schedule, but Pulitzer chartered a train, which was dubbed the Miss Nellie Bly Special, which took her to Chicago. So she made her triumphant return to New Jersey on January 25th, 1890, to massive crowds. Her total journey time was less than Phileas Fogg. It was 72 days, 6 hours, 11 minutes and 14 seconds, which was a new world record. Her rival, Miss Bisland, missed the steamship from Southampton and so had to take a slower boat, Bothania, from Cove in Ireland. And so she arrived back 4 days after Nellie. Nellie married, she was 31 years of age, she married 73-year-old Robert Seaman, and retired from journalism to look after this aging husband. He died in 1904, and she was left in control of his company, the Ironclad Manufacturing Company, which made steel containers, and she patented several inventions. But she did return to journalism. There she is. This is her in 1914 in Poland. She went to Europe and covered World War I. But she continued to highlight women's issues for the rest of her career. So then he wasn't as such a journalist, but another editor and publisher was Samuel Sidney McClure, who became known as a key figure in investigative, or as it was known at the time, muckraking journalism. He co-founded and ran McClures Magazine from 1893 until 1911, and they exposed numerous issues of wrongdoings in business and politics here in America. But more importantly, he hired journalists like Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens to expose, you know, this undercurrent, the Gilded Age type stuff, you know, the Standard Oil Trust, all of those things. He also published a lot of fiction and non-fiction by Sarah Jewett, Mark Twain, Jack London, and Stephen Crane, as well as Willa Cather. So he was born in County Antrim in 1857. The oldest of 4 sons. His father was a carpenter and a shipyard worker, and his mother was Elizabeth Gaston. The father died in a shipyard accident, and so Elizabeth McClure moved the family to Indiana, where she happened to have relatives. She found work herself washing clothes for a doctor's family, and she received housing through that job for her entire family, the 5 sons. The doctor who owned the home had a large library and allowed young Samuel to go in and read his books. In 1867, then, 10 years or so after she had landed in America, she married Thomas Simpson, who was a farmer. And Samuel said of his childhood, "We all worked hard, but it seemed to me that my mother worked hardest of all." He was able to go to, you know, high school and primary school there, but he said that his Irish accent afforded the boys there a great deal of amusement. So he had to work his way through high school. He said he could not afford a coat, and that speed was my overcoat, so he would run to school. To fund his education later, he worked as a teacher at a country school, he clerked in a grocery store, and eventually worked as a printer's devil for a local newspaper in Valparaiso. He learned how to set type there and prepare an edition for circulation. But eventually, in 1892, he launched a new monthly periodical to be called McClures Magazine, using articles and stories from his newspaper syndicate. He had little funds for this, and he considered that his real capital was my wide acquaintance with writers and with what they could produce. So he launched, of course, in 1893 during the financial panic. The museum initially did experience slow sales. I'm not sure if we haven't had a break, have we? No, we're good. It experienced slow sales, But, you know, it kind of kept coming. So the first print run was 20,000 copies and 12,000 were returned. That would kind of, you know, throw a lesser man off maybe, but McClure managed to keep the magazine in production really because of financial support from people like Arthur Conan Doyle, who were interested in what he was doing. Now, as editor, McClure saw himself as an open-minded individual with a natural enthusiasm for work and the willingness to hire staff with very little experience. So he drew to him writers like Booth Tarkington, Stephen Crane, Rudyard Kipling. You know, they published some of the Just So tales and all of that, and Jack London. Circulation received a boost too when he discovered the talents of Ida M. Tarbell. He reviewed some of her writing in 1893, and he's alleged to have said, "That girl can write. I want to get her to do some work for the magazine." So he went to Paris actually to meet her and offered her a job. So she, at that time, wrote some serialized biographies of Napoleon Bonaparte and Abraham Lincoln. And then in 1895, the magazine circulation rose to 250,000. Hoping to increase this even more, he really embraced the whole reform movement, with the likes of Tarbell kind of pushing him for this, but also Ray Stannard Baker and Joseph Lincoln Steffens. So his pieces on the Standard Oil Company and corruption in city governments really contributed to the rise of this muckraking journalism and boosted the population who read the thing to 500,000, 500,000 readers. McClure says that the origin of the muckraking movement came about almost by accident. He said, "I had no formal plan to attack existing institutions. It was the result of merely taking up in the magazine some of the problems that were beginning to interest the people a little bit before the newspapers and other magazines took them up." McClure helped this process along by paying his writers for their story and not the amount of copy they produced. And he gave them time to do the investigative work, which was the other thing. And so knowing that they would be paid, you know, for the entire thing and not just X amount of pennies a word, allowed them to master a particular subject and write with authority as a specialist really in the field. He eventually had to sell the magazine and he lost his role as editor in 1912. While Cather was a ghostwriter and he published his autobiography in 1914, and McClure's actually ceased publication that same year. He did, however, continue to work in journalism. He edited for a while the New York Evening Mail. He was very much a pacifist during World War I and before America entered the war, and he served as a delegate on Henry Ford's 1915 peace ship mission that tried to stop the trench warfare in Europe. In 1917, he wrote a book about politicians' failures regarding the war, and he died in 1949 at a hospital in the Bronx. So our next activist is this little woman you see here in the center of the picture. Historian in Ireland, Maurice Casey, has written about her kind of extensively. In February 1932, Mary Mooney, an 84-year-old woman from Mayo, stood on a stage before thousands in New York's Coliseum Theatre. Weary from travel and suffering from illness, Mooney was unable to speak clearly as she stood before the microphone, but this did not dissuade the attendees, many of whom knew her affectionately as Mother Mooney. One reporter described the amazingly cosmopolitan audience cheering and jostling to see this Irish immigrant, with people standing on their chairs trying to see her. Of course, she did not need to speak at length because her message was simple. In meeting halls across the country and in European cities like London and Berlin, her demand was repeated. She wanted her son released from California prison, and she wanted justice for a group of African-American teenagers who were facing execution on Alabama's death row. Mary Mooney was the mother of Irish-American radical Tom Mooney, framed and imprisoned for his alleged involvement in the 1916 San Francisco bombing, along with his friend Warren K. Billings, and they became the subject of an international justice campaign during this time. The visiting room of San Quentin prison hosted campaigners wanting to meet this world-famous prisoner, and all of the leading Irish activists at the time, like Jim Larkin and Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, who visited from Ireland, went to see him. But beyond the walls of the prison, it was his mother, Mary, who became one of the most recognisable faces of the campaign for his release. She was born Mary Heffernan in Belmullet in Mayo in around 1849, and left for the US in her late teens. So, of course, was lucky to survive a childhood during the Great Hunger. She settled in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and married a miner, Bernard Mooney, with whom she had 3 children. Bernard died when their eldest son, Tom, was 10, and Mary had to work in a paper factory. Tom became involved in politics through groups like the Socialist Party of America and the Industrial Workers of the World, eventually becoming an organizer of union activity in California. And, it's not surprising, I suppose, he grew up watching his mother work in factory conditions, and we know, they were not great at this time. So by the time her son was imprisoned in 1916 for that bombing in San Francisco, he had been very involved in left-wing politics for a long time. His mother was already in her 60s, and she dedicated the rest of her life to his release. As Mother Mooney, portrayed as the militant mother of an unjustly convicted son, she became a symbol of a broad campaign for political prisoners. The International Red Aid, which was a communist-led organization agitating for class war, advocated on Tom's behalf across the world. Branches built campaigns on behalf of persecuted leftists, particularly prisoners in the US, but also in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. They avoided mentioning really anyone who was in prison in Soviet Russia. In 1932, the International Red Aid called on its sections to link Tom Mooney's case to that of the Scottsboro Boys, a group of African-American teenagers who had been falsely accused of rape and sentenced to death as a means of breaking the walls of racial prejudice. The initial Scottsboro trial of the 9 accused was conducted in just 3 days with an entirely white, of course, and male jury. The sentence of death by electrocution was delivered for the teenagers, the youngest of whom was only 13 years old. And this prompted a national campaign for a reprieve and for retrials for them. So in 1932, an international Scottsboro and Mooney tour was organised. Mary Mooney, as again in her late 60s, was enlisted to travel the world from San Francisco to Moscow as part of the campaign. Her travelling and speaking companions included Ada Wright, the mother of one of the Scottsboro boys. No, that's not her there. That's Ada. And Richard B. Moore, who was an African Caribbean civil rights activist. And so that they were really promoting interracial solidarity across their platform. LA was hosting the Olympics that year, and so world attention was focused on America. During the closing ceremony of those games, protesters bearing Free Tom Mooney signs invaded the running track. The campaign certainly assisted in the eventual exoneration of both Mooney and the Scottsboro boys, although years of campaigning remained ahead for Tom in 1932 and decades more in the case of the Scottsboro boys. So Mother Mary Mooney never saw her son freed from prison in her lifetime. Her funeral in September of 1934, after a summer of wide-scale labour unrest in San Francisco, was attended by thousands, with, of course, the notable absence of her son, who was refused permission to attend. Her casket was placed in the city's civic auditorium, and the banner, Mother Mary, we will finish your fight, hung in the hall. Tom Mooney was pardoned and released from San Quentin in 1939. In November 2013, the state of Alabama's parole board granted a posthumous pardon to the final 3 Scottsboro boys who did not live to see their own exoneration. The role played by the immigrant from Mayo in this global campaign for justice is still a little-known story today. And our last campaigner is Samantha Power. In her memoir, The Education of an Idealist, Samantha Power talks about her Irish roots and her growing up with storytelling, how she came to the United States from Dublin at age 9 with her mother and younger brother. She talks about her alcoholic father and all of the kind of difficulties, that coming as an immigrant entailed. She talks about her own mistakes as well as her many accomplishments. As a new immigrant with a love of sports that she thought would help her fit in easily, she practiced speaking in an American accent in front of a mirror and tried to incorporate the new slang she was learning from her friends. In an interview with Irish Magazine, Power credited her Irish heritage for her work in humanitarian causes. I think that being Irish made me more interested in what was going on elsewhere in the world. It made me less insular and very interested in current events, war and conflict resolution. Admitted to Yale University in 1988, she quickly became a sports writer for the student newspaper and then got a job as an intern in the sports department with a CBS affiliate in Atlanta, where her family were living. While she was in the glass booth working as a journalist there, she noticed on a different TV screen that there were soldiers firing on civilians and students demonstrating for democratic reforms in China's Tiananmen Square. It left a deep impression on her, and she posted in her dorm room the Time magazine cover of one of the Chinese tanks. It was a turning point in her decision to become a history major with a strong interest in international affairs and human rights. By the time she graduated from Yale, the Berlin Wall had fallen and there was war across southeastern Europe. She took another internship with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., and she met a journalist who suggested she should go visit the Balkans. He got her an invitation to attend a conference in the newly independent Slovenia, and she ended up staying in that region for about 2 years, working as a freelance journalist. The atrocities and sufferings she witnessed had a major impact on the rest of her career, and she decided what she wanted to do was make a difference. She enrolled at Harvard Law School, and she kept an all-consuming focus on Bosnia, returning twice to Sarajevo. She took time off work to teach courses in foreign policy and human rights at Harvard's Kennedy School before finally graduating from law school in 1999. So a paper she had written while at school became her first book, called A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide. It was rejected by several publishers and finally came out in March 2002, eventually winning a Pulitzer Prize. Peter Galbraith, who she had met in Croatia while he was the US ambassador there, suggested that she should send the book to a friend of his, Senator Barack Obama, who was then in Illinois. She hadn't met him, but she wrote that she had been inspired by his message at the 2004 Democratic National Convention. So she shipped off the book, and several months later she received an email from an Obama scheduler noting that the senator would like to have dinner with her when she was next in Washington. This eventually led to a government job, which she struggled with because she had worked kind of on the outside as a campaigner and administrator. In all, the author, Samantha, spent more than 8 years working with the Obama administration, first as campaigner and foreign policy advisor, and then later in varied roles with the National Security Council, where she found the bureaucratic hurdles high. And she admits that she did kind of struggle with that. In his second term, Obama tapped her as US ambassador to the UN. Her friends had warned her that her hardest part of working with Obama or politicians in general would be trying to tame her own outspokenness. And while she did have a very good relationship with Obama personally as well as professionally, and he praised her values and goals, he also told her more than once, "You get on my nerves," because she advised him on policy, risks versus advantages. While at the UN, the Mexican ambassador once told her that she had to decide whether she was a diplomat or an activist. "You can't be both," he insisted. She replied, "I am both. We should all be both." So she was a passionate activist who wanted to right global wrongs, but over time she saw the need, or the only way of getting anything done was to settle for smaller steps. So she focused in her tenure at the UN on building coalitions. She tried to meet every other permanent representative to the UN, which she did except for North Korea's, and she really wanted to get to know them as people and hear the story, again, this Irish kind of influence that she'd had. While she was at the White House in the first administration with Obama, she was following, US foreign policy and was actively engaged in discussions and decisions. So she was particularly interested in the Gaddafi overthrow in Libya, and she also got herself designated as the White House coordinator for Iraqi refugees. She was very concerned about the safety of the Iraqi translators and noted that 17,000 Iraqi refugees were admitted to the US every year during the Obama administration. She also lobbied successfully for the creation of a new position at the National Security Council, the Director for War Crimes and Atrocities, again probably drawing on her experience with the Balkans and Slovenia in the late 90s. At the UN, she spent many hours in Security Council meetings. There were 263 sessions in her first year alone. She got involved with the Syria debate after Assad used maybe chemical warfare on his own people, and she wanted Obama to threaten airstrikes, but he retreated, saying that he needed Congress's approval first. But she passed a council resolution, which would allow airstrikes against Syria if it continued. She initiated the Council's first discussion of North Korea's brutal treatment of its own people and helped pass through other important UN Council resolutions on human rights issues like condemnation of attacks based on sexual orientation or help to end the Ebola crisis in West Africa. She made several trips to troubled regions of Africa to gather information firsthand, and she lobbied the UN Secretary General to chair a General Assembly event which raised $186 million in humanitarian aid for those affected by the Boko Haram terrorist attacks in West Africa. At the end of his tenure, Obama assured her, "I don't know anyone who cares more about people, and I couldn't be prouder of you." She retired from public life for a time, but she is now the US aid administrator under the Biden administration. When he nominated her, Biden said, "Samantha Power will rally the international community and work with our partners to confront the biggest challenges of our time, including COVID-19, climate change, global poverty, and democratic backsliding." A crisis-tested public servant and diplomat, Ambassador Power has been a leader in marshalling the world to resolve long-running conflicts, respond to humanitarian emergencies, defend human dignity, and strengthen the rule of law and democracy. So the immigrants and Irish Americans that we highlighted tonight in our fourth lecture, as I say, in the series, have been able to use their power and their voice to advocate for the powerless and to speak for the voiceless in America itself, but also across the world. As Samantha said, and I think this probably speaks to the motivations of all of the people we learned about tonight, you asked about justice, and I guess the best of the Irish humanitarian tradition was possibly found through missionary work, through the best of the church. But growing up, there was some sense of being part of a global community, of being connected to people and doing unto others as you would like done unto yourself. All of that was in the mix growing up in Ireland. And I think our politicians and muckraker journalists and lawyers that we looked at tonight all embody that spirit, that there's a bigger story than just your own. So if anyone has any questions on Facebook, you can type them into the chat and I'll answer, but I think you're probably all silent in there. And if anyone in the audience has a question, no, they're good here too. Our next event, I'm just looking at my calendar, is Monday. It's another lecture in this series. We will have Brendan Fay, the activist and filmmaker, who's going to talk about the Lavender and Green movement and the St. Patrick's Day for All, his work to be, inclusive of gay civil rights and to march in the St. Patrick's Day parade. We'll also have some things on exhibition up here in the museum about his life's work. And then on Thursday, we have a presentation. It will be on Zoom, so you can register for that Zoom or live on Facebook. I'll Zoom it onto Facebook, from a professor in Trinity College in Dublin, which starts at 6 p.m. our time because of the time difference. Dr. Dara Downey will talk about the use of the superstitious Irish maid in American Gothic fiction. So we're sticking with Halloween a little bit again on Thursday next week. So, Julia, thank you. I'm delighted you tuned in and glad you enjoyed it. The video will be available, to watch on Facebook later, or we're going to share it onto YouTube. But I look forward to seeing you all on Monday and get ready for November. We've got a full slate coming up on November 2. So thanks very much, everyone, for tuning in. Sharon, delighted to see you, and we'll be in touch. But I hope some of you will be able to come in person on Monday to see Brendan Fay's exhibit, or certainly be online for the talk. He's had an amazing career and life of activism as an Irish immigrant in New York, particularly, during the AIDS crisis and all that. So I think that'll be fabulous. So thanks very much, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Take care.